the best way to get away with murder is don't talk about it. And I never have. This is what makes murder so lonely. That and the guilt. My guilt is a room I visit but rarely, and when I do, I'm the only one that's there, or so it's been until tonight. I killed someone. I'd say in another life, but that's the trick of self-deception, isn't it? It wasn't me, it was him, the person I once was, but it was me. It's a cult experience taking a life. It doesn't just spook you out, it also renders you spooky. So, I'm spooky. Sometimes on the street I lock eyes with a stranger and imagine I recognize a fellow traveler, someone similarly marked. I can't ask, of course, I just have to coast through, breathing that uncertain air called the secrets of other people. My grandfather was a German. He was a German immigrant. He passed away when I was 10. He was a preoccupied man, a musician who had experienced things of which he never spoke, but his playing of Schubert in particular was colored by an understanding of something beyond speech, beyond perhaps what we understand to be human. He sang one song, The Doppelganger, and when he sang it, which he did but rarely, it left me mute. That such pain could exist. When he voiced the last note and would thereafter be silent, the whole house fell silent with him. There were numbers on his arm, after all. He was my teacher, and in the course of things, he accidentally revealed to me that music was my life. Until it wasn't. Perhaps it was the way he treated his hands on the keys before playing. He regarded them as one would the hands of a stranger. I identified with his pause and this alienation. The length of his fingers would just lay there lifeless, and then suddenly the skeleton inside his hands would arch awake and launch. In that moment, the moment when the music used him, I found my use. Just shy of 40 years ago, I was not spooky, or maybe I was. I don't know, people don't change, right? I've always had visions, the kind that Dostoevsky talked about, or poor Chopin fell victim to. Like Chopin, I have a touch of epilepsy, focal epilepsy, they call it. I start staring and walking in circles, and often for a minute, I can't hear anybody. This is why they threw me out of the Marine Corps. I had an episode during a night compass march in Panama. We were climbing a wet clay hill in the dark when my sergeant, an otherwise good guy, shone a flashlight in my eyes, and it set me off. I saw a starburst and then thousands of silent dogs converging on us. Other stuff too. When I lifted my weapon and yelled, "Stop! Stop!" When I yelled that into the empty darkness, well, that did it. They thought I was psycho. At my hearing, I argued that Julius Caesar, the greatest soldier who ever lived, was subject to fits as well, but battalion headquarters was in no mood for the classics, and I was out. They gave me a nice discharge, though. Good benefits. My seizures start with a kind of circular buzzing in the head, followed by what I call a flash. These flashes are pictures that move slightly, sometimes a lot of pictures, unrelated, sharing only the quality of intense foreboding. The whole thing revolves at the base of my skull like a slowly rotating platter of dread, a queasy carousel which leaves me sick and uncertain. I don't know what it was like for Caesar, but for me it's a drag. When I was 16 in the Bronx, I was looking at the moon one night, and I suddenly flashed on this girl. She was an Irish kid I knew from around school, super young, like 13, and I saw in her some other moonlight, having sex on a big rock. I knew the rock. It was in the city lot, a kind of no man's land where kids of yet undeclared wandered in and out of crime, and there were 3 boys standing around her in the flash, and a man moved on her like a slowly flexing pair of tongs. She laid there, She was pink. She might as well have been dead, her eyes staring. There was no sound, but I could hear the silence. I was aware of the whole thing, that the whole thing was a hallucination. But I felt certain that it was really happening to her. What I saw shocked me enough that the next day I went to the lot and stared at it, looking in vain for some kind of confirmation. What I didn't realize was that it hadn't happened yet. A year later, the girl ran home from being raped, blabbed the whole thing to her dad, who also happened to be a cop, and the boys involved were immediately knee-deep in shit. They never found the man who actually did it. And that's when I realized I had seen the future. I've seen death, too, in a flash, and in real time. Which brings me back to 40 years ago. I was in a perishable marriage, in college for the second time. Juilliard hadn't worked out. An impoverished graduate student, I had already had several lives, a pianist, a delinquent Marine. And here I was again, perhaps playing a fresh hand. The one odd thing that you would have noticed about me during this chapter of my life, just as a face, was how pale I was. And somehow my poverty, which explained my lifeless clothes, my shapeless hair, and extended even to sunlight, I budgeted my exposure to brightness like a bookkeeper who reports back to some spectral quartermaster. I believed at the time that sunlight triggered the lesion in my brain and caused me to faint, or at least invited dizziness, so I hurried shadow to shadow, dodging bright stretches like a convict evading a searchlight. I linked illumination with unraveling, with comeuppance, pain. I guess I vaguely sensed I might be bad. I had an unfortunate purpose. I preferred to avoid mirrors and self-inspection. I had a variety of part-time jobs to support the university habit. I often delivered things. My then wife, it's hard to name her, and not because of lapse of memory, but because she had this tick of changing her name. She went through several identities while we were coupled, and I was required at each new iteration to inform family and friends that they must henceforward address her as such and such. It was a fucking disaster. My then wife, like me, walked through life collecting small employment like forest people collect herbs. Occasionally, one of those occupations would allow her to sub-employ me, for instance. If the job involved brute strength, well, I'm that guy. And so it was in the course of delivering a ridiculously heavy and seriously prehistoric upright piano that I met the German. Actually, she was Danish, but fuck her, I don't know her any accuracy. She might have been from Hamlet's homeland, but she had a German way of inflicting everything with effortless cynicism and withering judgment. I wish I never laid eyes on her. Smelled her. Noticed the density of her hair. God help me. Heard her voice. My reaction to her was almost molecular. I instantly and irreversibly associated the entirety of her being. I absorbed her. I was Saul, knocked from my mule by a bright light. And there was something about this, about her relentless front, appearance, tone of purity that poisoned every day of my existence from that moment until a late blooming epiphany at last set me free. There's so much I just didn't understand about women, both then and now, but one thing I have learned is that if a woman is betrayed at such a young enough age as Dane was, her eyes root out every trace of treachery that the world contains, except for the rot of her own heart. In short, it is an unfortunate thing that we met. She showed up at maybe the last possible moment I might have gotten on an unpolluted, simple path leading upwards, or so I like to tell myself. You know, at certain moments, it's imperative not to be seen, I think. One can weather much if invisible and oblivious, and I mastered both, having found it necessary to repurpose my life in a firmly unreflective way. Until the dame, that is, whom I heard before I saw, like one hears the understated beginnings of an avalanche. She was counting off Scarlatti's sonata in that exacting, suffocating way that dance teachers and choreographers have. I walked in, and my arrival was unexpected. And she looked at me bluntly, and suddenly I was dirty, and she was clean just like that. It was like crossing the international date line. And even though she subsequently lied and cheated and stole, still to this day, when I think of her, I am the dirty party, and she's spotless. The first thing she said to me when I took the door was, "Innigkeit." I had no idea what the word means, nor would I until I saw her breasts for the first time a year later. But to avoid unnecessary suspense, it is a German word, and it means depth. It's a term associated with musical appreciation, which makes sense as she was looking at the piano when the word fell from her lips almost imperceptibly, and without her knowledge, which perhaps it did. Because later, when I reminded her of the Innigkeit moment, she rejected it as an item exclusively of my manufacturer. She was like that. She laid shit at my feet like a cat. The funny thing was, when she called me Innigkeit, I knew instinctively that it was accurate and that it was not a good thing. But the piano was massive. It had a busy veneer of zebra wood, I think, and it had been converted in some bygone time from player to manual by, I don't know, whomever. My employer, which in this case was the same university where I attended classes, had commissioned my wife, who in turn empowered myself to buy old pianos for student rehearsal rooms. The instruments could be acquired for little or nothing in this era, the 70s. Suffer minor repairs, be returned as a service I could perform, and serve young singers and dancers for a year or two before descending into a final uselessness. And my buddy Vinny was probably downstairs driving in circles in the van when I rolled this particular behemoth through the studio door. Did I mention that my wife and I had stopped having sex the year before? No, of course not. Who wants to admit that sort of thing, huh? My fluidly named spouse had tried to kill me with a butcher knife. Infidelity, hers. And due to my months in the dojo, failed. Her second line of attack was a launch of domestic ice age, where nookie was non-existent and misery plentiful. After 10 months of no ass and other affronts, I had the eyes of an anarchist. I stared at people like I was looking at the ocean. People were uneasy. It was the state of the guy pushing this piece of shit piano through the doorway of a rehearsal lot. The woman holding the door was crazy tall, blonde, strangely dressed in some kind of Russian tunic and tights, a weird face. She looked symbolic. Her blue eyes held a brand of neutrality that was new to me. And in those Arctic lookouts, I believe I saw myself for the first time since the catastrophe. The news was sobering. I'd become a filthy rag of a man, beaten down, introverted, an oyster, a thing without self-esteem or sense of self at all. I was as tall as her, but somehow she towered, looking down at me, her gaze unsullied by confusion. And I looked back up at her in quiet chaos. I tuned the piano, and then, shocking myself, I sat down and played a passage from the Scarlatti sonata I'd overheard. I guess this was my way of showing her that I was somebody. It didn't work. When I glanced up at her for her assessment, she offered her impassive verdict in a single word: bloodless. The conversation died there and then as if by rifle shot. Across from us, the wall was mirrored. There was a dance bar, a couple of kids in tights, and a ratty white upright with some caved-in keys. This was the one I was supposed to remove as trash. I didn't ask her help. But when she noticed me struggling, she grabbed the dolly and she shoved it under like a pro. I might have thanked her then and there had she not also, on rising, put her other hand on the small of my back, which enraged me. Why, you ask? Well, if you've ever had a choreographer put their hand on you, you know it bypasses the mind and dictates its vision directly to the body. I mean, she had that touch. A circuit was completed. My flesh heard her loud and clear as she wanted me gone. My flesh heard her, but beyond her, it heard more. Another entity, the cloud of all languages and numbers in which we blunder, and that made me angry and sick too. A surfeit of knowledge is no gift to give a guy who prefers the dark. I fell into a kind of knowing. And so it was, I practically fled, the steel door shutting behind me like a portcullis, but the image of her somewhere behind me, rejecting me as I was, her icy eyes, her hand, and where the hand took me, well, the whole thing lingered. I felt myself seized somehow, like my grandfather's resting hands were seized by music, both alien and too personal. Something shifted in my heart. A dull boom rocked me like cannon fire that once upon a time dislodged sunken suicides from the river. Later that day, I found myself putting the white piano in my studio apartment as my wife. Let's call her Sybil. While she looked on with bemused expression, she observed in an uncomplimentary murmur that the piano looked like me. The instrument had, among other afflictions, a cracked soundboard and was unplayable. Sybil seemed unsurprised. I was salvaging the unsalvageable, and she found me inexplicable and yet not mysterious. My actions were either so obvious to her as to exempt them from comment, or so witless that she could only sigh. Which she did. A lot. It was a bad marriage. We lived in a deco building in Chelsea. When you walked in, you were faced with a large foyer, which you slowly understood to be the entire apartment. It was unclear where we slept or lived, even. We had a green couch, Scandinavian. It was constructed of like 3 firm cushions on a metal frame. At night, it was converted to a double bed with a centrally located and prominent steel bar, symbolizing, I suppose, our marital state. Hence, we slept like monks or unclaimed cadavers in some hospital cellar. Sometimes I fantasized jumping the divider. Sometimes I masturbated as if I were alone. I don't know what she did. We drank a lot. Bourbon and ginger ale. It was all an intermission. The night I came home with a white piano that looked like me was when the marriage dropped off a stitch or fell into an icy chasm or whatever you like. It was a Friday, and we often celebrated Friday by getting smashed. Sybil had snagged a bottle of bourbon from somewhere, and I made sandwiches somehow, and then we grimly proceeded to eat and drink our way into some kind of upholstered agony while watching MASH and the Rockford Files. I remember staring at pink collages that a friend of ours had given us. A southern girl named Peggy. Peggy had sparkle eyes, and I found myself thinking about her and the Dane mushed together as I drained the last of the bourbon. Why had I played the piano that afternoon? I hadn't played since the catastrophe. And why for the Dane who was so unsympathetic? I looked up at the clock. Midnight. I became aware of a sensation. I felt a hand. There was a hand pressing the small of my back. I looked around. Was it my wife? No. I heard her banging around in the kitchen. It's funny, I thought. I got up and I shouted something to Sybil and I went out. And the night was waiting for me, and I walked through the humid air super fast, grinning about nothing, It was summer. I had no thoughts. I stared at passerby with unnerving candor and took delight in making them look away. I was drunk. The lights of Chelsea funneled into me, my head swiveling to catch all that was cheesy and bright. New York felt unmapped, unknowable, thick with lurid details, a contaminated crime scene. Every surface had been written on, pissed on, fucked against. I walked freestyle like loose notation on drifting on an unlined page. The sensation of the hand against my spine continued, an impetus. Then I was in front of Peggy's house, on her intercom, and she buzzed me in, and I was in her apartment. I looked at Peggy, thinking she should be taller somehow, like the Dane. We had chemistry, Peggy and I. Why, I don't know. We'd never done anything. She was an incest survivor. I was married, or stupid. She'd been a clothing designer, had a couple of nervous breakdowns, and took up art. Her apartment was her studio. Paintings and collages stacked up everywhere. We sometimes worked together, coding meaningless surveys for a woman named Susan. She oversaw a coding clique out of her apartment. Susan had this look of a fish that had grown enormous and content by eating all the other fish. At lunch, she served all the coders. There was usually 5 of us, and she served us sandwiches made of dark tuna, because dark tuna is cheap. And in the afternoons, we'd belch fish oil and lie about our lives, except Peggy, who repeatedly let fall that her father had slept with her. On one of these occasions, I cried suddenly and briefly, and then apologized. After that, Peggy started to give me art, especially collages. All of them were powdered pink, feminine dreams ruined by the realities of sex. I liked them all. My favorite, the piece that launched me into my midnight visit, revolved around a pair of pink beribboned toe shoes and felt like a dead dream. I stood in her studio, my hair stuck to my forehead, and I thought of the Dane and how I didn't exist anymore. Peggy said stuff with her southern lilt, but I knew the only thing that mattered was fucking her, and fast. I'd had a sense for some time that her charisma clock was running out, and that when that hour struck, she would be dull in the eyes for good. I think she felt the pressure of that expiration too. The conversation dried up quickly. Peggy touched my face. There was a dog scampering around us and art everywhere, finished and unfinished. There was a mattress, dead in the middle of the floor like a swimming raft. I remembered Peggy's collage on my wall just then. I kissed her hard and threw her down, and she went. She was a leaf in my weather, and I hadn't had sex in 700 years, and the dog was barking, and I remembered the dog visions in Panama, and I fell on Peggy and fucked her seemingly on contact. The mutt went crazy, leaping over us in some sort of mongrel rainbow, and her pussy was an O-ring, a tight seal. It had a life of its own, her pussy, and it had muscle memory, and I guess it fucked me independent of her gaze, which seemed cubist. For myself, I don't remember the event physically. I had a vision of mulch holding a sapling steady, of South America, tropical fjords, Hawaii. I saw Odysseus on the Hudson, and I heard Scarlatti. My grandfather appeared with his veiled eyes luxuriating in grief, voicing Schubert's The Doppelganger, and then the rock, the boys, the girl, the pinkish moon, the man on her, the silence that had kidnapped me. The art around us started crashing into my eyes. She had some kind of trumpet music playing that invoked a golden kill on the Serengeti, and the rug had a design that reminded me of God whom I'd forgotten. And I came so hard, there was an after moment that was shattered and whole, both at the same time, like an archipelago, followed by my old escort, Oblivion. don't remember leaving, but I did because then I ended up at a bar called the No Name Bar, talking to two girls by a jukebox who were buying me vodkas. There was an untethered feeling of urgency. We were on a rotting pier looking at the Hudson River, hearing the hoarse cries of gay men we couldn't see. We were across the street from the Port Authority in a doorway. She was sucking my cock as I watched buses pass. I was as remote in my reflection as Aristotle studying dolphins. Finally, she took one of the buses, and I was alone. A feeling of destiny overtook me. A porn palace appeared. I saw the sign, Candy's World. One of my eyes began to bleed a little. It happens sometimes. I walked in. There were rooms and hallways and booths and levels. It was really many buildings connected by a secret, spidery set of passageways, and everywhere women. Men roamed search parties of desire. Suddenly, I was on course. The hand was gone. I was isolated from all the humanity, save one. My years of stoicism forgotten, I found a tissue, dabbed my eye. I could feel the pulse looking for me. What was it? Something rancid, incomplete, homeless, the kind of hunter fugitive that flies through the world. I heard a voice say, "Must the soul be broken also?" It was an old man's voice, and it was mine. I found the fire stairs and took them, and I remember thinking that fire stairs should be on fire. There was the smell of blood and ammonia. I came to a door standing open, the roof. I stood and I looked out at the whole city. My mind was blank. A guy was sitting in a beach chair smoking a cigar. He looked like a businessman, cheap suit. I said hi, and he offered me a stogie. It was dry and flaky, and it lit up hot and bright. He smoked against the sky. He said he never talked to anybody and that his life was money and he was dying. He said he was married, had kids, but he hated them all, and himself too. He said in his hatred he had found freedom, but that freedom was overrated. His name was Stanley, and his heart was shot, his physical heart. He'd already had 2 attacks, plus emphysema, and he looked at it. I mean, his skin looked like steamed chicken. He was sweating. He told me he'd made his fortune in porno because when he was a kid, sex and money were the only magic he could find, but now there was no magic, only death. He said he saw death in everything and love nowhere. He said all this to me, slumped in his beach chair like a Roman emperor. And I could tell he was still working on his story, rewriting, chasing the dissolving smoke of a hoped-for significance. And then I found myself channeling at him from some frozen place. I said, "My heart is shut and I can't get in." He started to laugh, stopped, acted like he didn't understand, so I said it again, and that stopped him. "My heart is shut, and I've been running. You too, maybe, but life's too long. A girl got raped." He was trying to follow my thought, but I'd outrun him. "What?" I could tell he was irritated. He'd just spun me a version of his life, and I'd shown no interest, but he'd skimped on his story, and I knew it. He asked about my bloody eye. Had I been in a fight? "A girl got raped," I repeated. "There was a full moon. Do you remember me?" He looked stunned, so I went on. The judge gave us a choice, jail or the Corps. He knew we didn't do it, but he knew we didn't stop it either. That's how we ended up in the Marines instead of Juilliard. "Do you remember me, Stanley?" He was still suddenly. He said no. I dabbed my eye again. The bleeding had stopped. "Let me tell you about the future. In the future, I'll forget all of this. I'll forget you. All of this will be erased, and I'll be swamped by my own waters." I pointed to the city below. "There's another part of me that's out there. There's another part of me out there right now, looking for me, my second self, and he will find me. I'm like this spirit that hovers outside of a woman's womb. I leaned away from him. It felt good to say these things, but then I remembered the dead years. I saw you, I said flatly. Stanley nodded, asking, "You were there?" "Yeah," I said. "You were one of the kids?" "Yes," I answered. I'm examining my hands, which had blood on them. "How did you find me?" he asked. I showed him my speckled palms. Something pushed me. Maybe all anybody needs is one push. And maybe when all else fails, destiny gives us that. He sat up in his beach chair, coughing and smoking, and he smiled a little. There was malice in it. He had the eyes of a snake. Something in what I'd said had revived him. I didn't like him being affected by me, even momentarily saved by me. Because maybe it isn't such a good idea to save evil either. Maybe you have to choose. "Listen," said Stanley, the pornographer. "This is funny now. You come to me now, it's too late. The guy who did all that stuff, I'm not him anymore." I shook my head. He was him. "I'm dying," he said. "The girls who work for me, the guys who come for the girls, they're straw people, dolls, me too. We don't know anything. I never had a day when I chose to be this guy. I just am." I looked at his face. I knew what he was. There are people who fly away from the sun and towards the dark places like upside-down geese who seek winter. And maybe because the dark is almost everywhere, the warm sun is hard to find. He was one of those. And he had kidnapped me. And he had a huge coughing fit and went white and spit. And he was panting, but he wanted to say more. "You're looking for somebody, and you think that somebody's looking for you, huh? Where'd you get those clothes? We're all in costumes. We're made up names. We're living in the most boring lives we can find. Look at me. Could I have a worse life? Look at my clothes. They're worse than yours. I'm playing a part. I'm a puppet. You know what happens when you make your money out of pussy? You never get past being born. I never took my first step, and now I'm done. There is no second person. Nobody's looking for you. This is all there is. So guess what? Of the two of us, I win, because I'm not waiting to be saved." The cigar he'd given me had gone out, and he leaned towards me to relight it. For so long, I'd avoided the light. Not only because brightness hurt me, but because I was searching for something that can only be found in the dark. A faceless thing. The flare from his lighter found the lesion in my brain. I started walking in a circle. I had the flash. It was the same one I had when I saw the silent dogs in Panama. It was the same one I always had, but each time more occult, like a gilded tarot card falling into a flame, like Scarlatti's Sonata, like Schubert, whom my grandfather sang with such inicat, such knowledge of the depths, but all the while clinging to beauty, which is perhaps buoyant and saves us from drowning. I saw the Dane's breasts, her betrayal, how I saved myself, the concerts, all of it. But most of all, I saw this man. The little girl in the pink collage, and me, 17, frozen by the arrival of a devil. And so I threw him off the roof. Because I'd seen that too. He never screamed. I knew he wouldn't. What I didn't know was that he had a suicide note in his pocket. And that's how I committed the perfect crime. He had been planning to kill himself. The next day, I walked into the Dane's rehearsal room and I played for her the passage from Scarlatti. I didn't ask her afterwards what she thought because we both knew. The music wasn't technical anymore. It was covered with blood. And that's how it started with her. What? What are you looking at? I told you I'm spooky. We all are. At least that's what I think. We're like gloves that God puts on when the work is unwholesome. What do you think I was going to tell you about the Dane? Fuck you. If you want melodrama, read your own diary. I will now go play Chopin's Nocturne in E minor, Opus 72. I'm going to ask them to dim the lights. We don't want an episode.